the 1990s, Formula One was a split world. At one end stood Michael Schumacher, a titan of the sport, a man whose salary alone could buy entire midfield teams. He was the face of success, the embodiment of elite motorsport wealth. But surprisingly, lining up on the same grid, often buried inside the midfield chaos, was a quiet Brazilian driver whose personal family fortune made even Schumacher look modest. His name was Pedro Diniz. He wasn't backed by a rich parent. He wasn't funded by a millionaire. Diniz was funded by a retail empire, one of the largest in Latin America. From the day he entered Formula One, he was labeled a joke, a moving chicane, and the ultimate symbol of pay driver excess. And yet, he lasted 6 seasons. He outqualified more experienced teammates, partnered with world champions, survived one of the sport's most terrifying fire incidents, and walked away on his own terms to become an influential businessman. This is the story of Pedro Diniz, the driver who proved money doesn't just buy a seat, it buys time. The Sugarloaf empire, the backing behind the driver. Pedro Diniz was born into a world where resources were never a concern. His father, Abilio Diniz, was one of Brazil's most powerful businessmen, the force behind Grupo Pão de Açúcar, the Sugarloaf Group, a retail empire that started as a small São Paulo bakery and grew into one of Latin America's largest supermarket chains. By the 1990s, the Diniz family controlled an empire worth billions, and their company was synonymous with daily life in Brazil. For Pedro, this meant something almost unheard of in motorsport: limitless financial backing. When he moved to Europe to pursue racing, sponsors didn't need to be convinced of his talent. They were companies that supplied Pão de Açúcar's shelves, and supporting the young Diniz meant premium product placement across hundreds of stores. By 1995, this network of wealth and influence allowed the family to purchase Pedro a seat at Forte Corse, one of Formula One's slowest and most cash-starved teams. It was an expected move, a wealthy driver joining a struggling team, a perfect match. From the moment he arrived, the label was attached to him for life. Pay driver, not a racer, a customer. But what no one expected was how long he would survive, and how much he would improve. The fiery baptism, a crisis that defined his image. In 1996, Diniz joined Ligier, a step up in machinery but still far from competitive. It was here that one of the most dramatic moments of his career unfolded. During the Argentine Grand Prix, a faulty fuel valve malfunctioned during a pit stop. As Diniz accelerated out of the pits, his car suddenly erupted into a towering fireball. The flames engulfed the cockpit instantly, consuming the Ligier in a nightmare of heat and smoke. The world held its breath. And then, in a moment that stunned the paddock, Pedro Diniz climbed out of the inferno completely on his own, shaken yet unharmed. The British tabloids had a field day, famously printing headlines like "Diniz in the oven." The footage became some of the most replayed imagery of the season. To the public, it was further proof of the narrative. This wasn't a professional driver. This was a wealthy amateur being chewed up by the brutality of Formula One. But inside the paddock, attitudes began to shift. Diniz hadn't panicked. He hadn't frozen. He didn't flee the sport. He returned to the cockpit with quiet determination. The rich kid had spine, the quiet competence, proving the critics wrong. Something unexpected happened as the seasons progressed. Pedro Diniz got better, significantly better. From Ligier, he moved to Arrows in 1997, partnering with reigning world champion Damon Hill. Most assumed Hill would obliterate him, and in pure performance, Hill was clearly stronger. But Diniz wasn't humiliated. He held his own more often than anyone predicted. He scored points. He made smart, consistent drives. He rarely crashed. At one point during practice in Austria, he even set the fastest time of the session, in an Arrows. By the time he reached Sauber in 1999 and 2000, he was no longer viewed as a helpless backmarker. He worked alongside experienced drivers like Alesi, and on several race weekends he outperformed him. Diniz scored 10 career points, a small number by modern standards, but for a driver in midfield machinery of that era, it reflected legitimate progress. In fact, his reputation improved so much that rumors began swirling in 1999 that Ferrari, yes, Ferrari, was considering placing him alongside Schumacher. Not because he was the fastest, not because he was championship material, but because his sponsors were prepared to bring $20 million to secure the seat. It never happened, but the fact it was even discussed shows how much his presence had evolved. Diniz was no long. But because his sponsors were prepared to bring $20 million to secure the seat. It never happened, but the fact it was even discussed shows how much his presence had evolved. Diniz was no longer a punchline. He was a reliable driver with immense financial gravity. The mental battle, the pressure that broke through the helmet. But beneath the stable exterior was a storm. Being labeled a fraud, a pay driver, a man who didn't earn his seat, it wears on you. Diniz later admitted that the biggest struggle wasn't the car, the speed, or the competition. It was the psychological warfare of scrutiny. No matter how cleanly he drove or how much he improved, the stigma followed him. To the public, he could never be more than the billionaire's son. Then came another serious crash, the 1999 German Grand Prix, where his car flipped upside down in the gravel. It was a violent reminder of the risk he lived with every week. By the end of the 2000 season, something inside him shifted. The money was still there. Teams wanted him. But Diniz realized something important. He didn't love Formula One enough to keep sacrificing everything for a sport that refused to respect him, so he walked away, at his peak. By choice, not desperation. The second act, from driver to executive. After retiring, the Diniz family purchased a major stake in the Prost Grand Prix team, with Pedro briefly taking on a managerial role. It was a chance to prove his worth in a different arena, and he approached it with seriousness and strategic thinking. But his relationship with Alain Prost deteriorated quickly. The partnership clashed over decisions, philosophy, and direction, and by the time Prost GP collapsed in 2002, Diniz had severed ties with Formula One entirely. He had lived the F1 life, the glamour, the pain, the judgment, and he was ready for something real. The true empire, a legacy beyond the track. Leaving F1 wasn't an end for Pedro Diniz. It was the beginning of his actual career. He returned to Brazil and transformed the family farm into Fazenda da Toca, one of the most advanced organic and sustainable agriculture projects in Latin America. Instead of chasing podiums, he studied ecology, regenerative farming, and sustainability. Today, Diniz is a respected voice in agroforestry. He sits on sustainability boards, leads agricultural initiatives, and has become an advocate for organic food systems in Brazil and beyond. His influence now reaches millions of people, not through racing but through something far more lasting: food, land, and ecological renewal. Pedro Diniz's career isn't a story about lap times or trophies. It's a story about perception, and how perception can blind people to truth. He entered F1 with unlimited money, but that didn't guarantee respect. He was mocked, underestimated, and dismissed. Yet he survived 6 seasons in the world's most demanding sport. He scored points. He improved. He earned a measure of credibility that money alone could never buy. And in the end, he left not as a joke, but as a man who chose a different legacy. Diniz proved that in Formula One, money may buy a seat, but character determines how long you stay. And Pedro Diniz stayed long enough to become unforgettable. He wasn't the fastest. He wasn't the most naturally gifted, but he was relentless. He kept showing up, he kept learning, he kept proving people wrong, one quiet weekend at a time. Behind the helmet was a driver who refused to be defined by his critics. Behind the name was a person fighting for legitimacy. Every race was another chance to silence a joke with a result. Every lap was a reminder that heart cannot be bought. He grew tougher, he grew smarter, he grew into a racer nobody expected him to become. He endured crashes, failures, and headlines that mocked him. Yet he chose business and farming. He stepped away from the roar of engines and toward the rhythm of the earth, a choice that surprised many but made perfect sense to him. Because real growth doesn't always happen on a racetrack. Sometimes it happens in soil, in patience, in building something that lasts longer than a lap. He invested in sustainable agriculture. He learned the science behind the harvest. He studied markets the way he once studied telemetry. He brought the discipline of racing into the world of agribusiness. And soon, the joke that he only had money faded for good. He was no longer just the driver with a sponsor father. He became a businessman with a vision. He built companies that fed people. He focused on organic production before it became a trend. He pushed for environmental responsibility not because it was fashionable, but because it was necessary. He hired experts, listened to them, and grew with them. His farms expanded, his influence grew, and the world outside racing began to notice his leadership. The same resilience that kept him in Formula One now sustained his business empire. He proved you could reinvent yourself without losing who you are. He proved that life after F1 can be richer than the years inside it. He became respected not for speed, but for stewardship, not for overtaking, but for overseeing. And once again, Pedro Diniz defied expectations, this time by cultivating a legacy rooted in purpose, growth, and the quiet power of reinvention.